Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of GovCon Live. My name is Carroll Bernard, a co-founder of Govology.com, and I'm joined by my co-host, retired GovCon attorney, regulations expert, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Stephen Koprince. Hey, Stephen, how you doing today?
Hey, doing just fine, Carol. Keep pumping me up in these introductions. It helps my ego. So I appreciate that. So happy to be here again. Always fun to have these chats with you in these kind of more informal setting here with our GovCon Roundup Live. So looking forward to today's.
Awesome, man. Hey, I love doing these shows with you. And today we've got another interesting topic to discuss related to the FAR overhaul. There's been so many things talked about in the media, in the news, everywhere. So many things are happening. Today, we're going to be talking about the latest round of proposals from the Office of Management and Budget. In fact, there were 16 proposals that were sent to Congress. We're only going to talk about 3 of those today because of the time limitations. But for those of you who want to take a look at all of the 16 proposals, if you just go and Google OMB 16 proposals, you'll find some links to some blog articles as well as to the GSA website where they have these 16 proposals listed. So we're going to get into this today, Stephen, because 2 of the 3, especially that we're going to be discussing, and that's going to have some impact to small business, will also likely have some impacts to the rule of 2. I thought that a good starting point, especially for the folks that may be new to GovCon, or simply for those of us who may need a refresher on the rule of 2 and as it stands right now, maybe you could start to talk about that. What is the rule of 2? What is the current threshold and how the rule of 2 works, as well as part 2 to this question, what is going on with the rule of 2? We've heard some things where it seems like some folks are trying to get rid of it, while there's been a bill introduced to Congress to codify the rule of 2 into law, which we're hoping will go through. For those of you online with us today, we encourage you to talk to your congressional reps and senators to encourage them to codify the rule of 2 into law. I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephen. Maybe you can give us a quick overview of this rule of 2 and where it stands today.
Yeah, and that's a good place to start. It lets me set the stage in terms of the bigger picture of what we're looking at here in terms of statutes, regulations, what this revolutionary FAR overhaul process can achieve on its own versus what Congress needs to do, which gets us back to these GSA recommendations. Because what GSA or OMB has done is gone beyond what the revolutionary FAR overhaul process can achieve on its own through its own regulatory authority to things that only Congress can change. And so this is OMB saying, hey, Congress, we can't do this. We'd like to. Can you do it for us? And so that's where these 16 proposals come in. The rule of 2 really is going to be at the centerpiece of what we're talking about for at least a couple of these topics today regarding the micro purchase threshold and especially the simplified acquisition threshold. The rule of 2 is really the centerpiece of the government's efforts, and it has been for decades, to meet a statutory mandate. A statute, of course, is the thing that Congress adopts, is passed into law. It's the bill on the Hill, House and Senate pass the bill, President signs it into law typically. And that's the law of the land. It can become law with over the president's signature or whatever. We're not going to get into that. Law of the land is codified in the U.S. Code or USC. So if you see USC, we're not talking about the Trojans or the Gamecocks. We're talking about the United States Code. And in the parts involving contracting, there is a mandate that the government give small businesses the fair opportunity to compete for and receive contract awards. There is also a specific mandate in statute now. Again, this is the law of the land. Only Congress can amend or revoke a statute. Congress has adopted by statute what's called a rule of 2, and that's a colloquial term for contract actions that are anticipated. The value is going to be between what's called the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. Under statute, the micro purchase threshold currently is $10,000. The simplified acquisition threshold, $250,000. And so between those dollar values, and that's a $240,000 range, those contract actions must be set aside. In other words, only small businesses can compete for and be awarded those contracts whenever the contracting officer has a reasonable expectation that 2 or more small businesses are likely to submit offers at fair market prices. And so if that rule of 2, if you've got 2 competitors or more, then by statute, by law, only small businesses can compete for and receive those awards. And what happens with the statute is that it's typically then expanded upon and implemented through a regulation published in the CFR. That's the Code of Federal Regulations. And that has happened with this rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition threshold. That has been published in the FAR as part of the CFR, by the way, Title 48 of the CFR. That has been published at FAR 19.502-2. And so you have under FAR 19.502-2, the requirement that between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, small businesses receive the contract opportunities they're set aside for small business whenever there's likely going to be two or more small business competitors. FAR Council, which is the entity that writes the FAR, using its independent regulatory authority, has gone beyond the bare minimum requirements of the statute, because the FAR Council also has the mandate to achieve the congressional goal of providing that fair opportunity for small businesses to compete for contract awards. And the FAR Council is looking at that government-wide goal that small businesses receive at least 23% of prime contracting dollars every year. The tool that the FAR Council has adopted to meet and achieve that 23% goal and provide that fair opportunity is to take the mandate for the rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds and say we're essentially doing a slightly less strict version of that, but we're doing essentially that above the simplified acquisition threshold too. The rule of two applies to anything over the micro purchase threshold. There's a slightly stricter application between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds. Under FAR 19.502-2, the same concept applies above the micro purchase threshold as well. When you have two or more qualified, capable small businesses likely to submit offers at fair market prices, you got to set aside the work for small business or use some other small business vehicle like an 8A contract, something like that. So that's where we come today. We have this statutory mandate for the rule of two at certain dollar values. We have a regulatory mandate for the rule of two at higher dollar values. And that's where, when we talk about codifying the rule of two, there's been a lot of concern in the government contracting small business marketplace that this revolutionary FAR overhaul process could do away with the rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold, because you don't need Congress's approval to do that. The FAR Council passed that regulation, it can pull that regulation back. And so when we talk about codifying the rule of two, what we mean is writing a statute that says between the simplified acquisition threshold and micro purchase threshold in our U.S. code, but now we're saying that it applies at all dollar values. And we're not just saying it in the FAR, we're saying it in statute. There are bills now in the House or Senate that would do that out of concern that this revolutionary FAR overhaul process could eliminate the rule of two mandate above the simplified acquisition threshold, thereby undermining one of the key vehicles toward providing small businesses with contract opportunities at the federal government.
As it stands now, just a quick recap, I want to touch on these thresholds one more time because this kind of gets to be a very important aspect of the first two proposals that we're going to discuss today. So $10,000, that's the micro purchase threshold, with the exception of construction and services that have prevailing wage rates in it. Those are a little bit lower. And then that goes up to $250,000. Within that range, then you've got some regulations stating that if there's two or more small businesses, the contracting officers shall make a set aside for small business, right?
Yeah, that's it. And keep in mind that below the micro purchase threshold, it's kind of just game on. That's where you're using your government credit card or government purchase card. There's no small business set aside requirements. It's loose in terms of the requirements of the buy. Below that threshold, the government runs over to Office Depot or whatever, plops down the credit card and buys the printer it needs right away. We're not going to worry about paperwork of doing a set aside and all these sorts of things below the $10,000.
Yeah, below the threshold becomes very important to these next two proposals that were the top and the bottom of the thresholds. I'm going to read the overviews of what's being proposed in two of the three things we're going to discuss today. Then we'll get your feedback and have some questions about this. The first is streamlining compliance and competition procedural requirements. This proposal would raise the simplified acquisition threshold for commercial products and services from $250,000 as it is currently set to $10 million over 5 years, and increase the limits for special simplified procedures from $5 million to $50 million in the same time frame. The goal is to streamline compliance, reduce competition-related procedural burdens, and speed time to mission, is what it says. So the second proposal on this is a separate one, which is going to be common sense procedures for small purchases. This proposal would raise the micro purchase threshold in phases from $10,000 to $100,000 over 5 years, removing government unique barriers for small business buys while keeping the Buy American Act in place to ensure domestic sourcing remains a priority for buyers and sellers. So now, with what you just said about the current threshold being 10 million to 250,000 or 10,000 to $250,000, and you just also said that under that threshold, there's no really requirements for small business set aside. So when we take a look at that second one, if that's going to go up to $100,000, effectively, it'll take out $90,000 off of that range. But the other part of that range is moving up. So can you explain this? Because if the range moves up to 10 million, and let's just say the new range is $100,000 to $10 million, now does the rule of two start to apply to the new simplified acquisition threshold?
Yeah, and the answer is going to be no, and I'll tell you why in a second. Something that amuses me is that when you read this list of the OMB's proposals here, somebody put this through like the marketing spin doctor people. Several of these proposals, or at least a couple of them, have the word common sense tagged in front of them, including, by the way, the proposal to charge you fees for registering in SAM. They call that common sense fees. I'm like, I thought it was common sense to not charge fees for this stuff, but now they put it in a place where if anyone opposes this proposal, it's like, well, you're against common sense. So you can tell that somebody with a background in that kind of spin doctoring world had a hand in naming some of these proposals with an eye toward the pushback and setting it up so that anyone who pushes back is against common sense, even when it comes to charging fees for registering in SAM, which is not a proposal we're going to talk about today, but has gotten attention elsewhere. So yeah, let's start with the micro purchase. Part of it is moving the floor up. And of course, you understand why GSA and OMB are interested in this. Because remember, there's more going on here than just the small business stuff. And we got to keep that in mind as well. I'm a small business advocate. I look at everything with the small business lens. And so I'm going to come right back to that in a second. But I also want to put myself in the shoes of an agency that's trying to buy stuff and do it in an efficient manner and deal with inflation and saying, look, what we really want to do is make our buys more efficient when we're buying at lower dollar values. And so we're going to increase that floor from $10,000 up to $100,000 so we can take our purchase card without dealing with all the paperwork and get things done. That's the best approach for the taxpayers. And maybe that's true. That's an argument that has some common sense to it. So I see where they're coming from with that. However, from the small business perspective, we've increased the floor. If this goes through, by the way, this is a proposal. This hasn't happened. This is GSA saying, Congress, in statute, it says $10,000. We would like you to step that up to $100,000 over a 5-year period. If Congress agrees and makes the amendment that OMB has proposed, then the corresponding floor of the requirement to do rule of two acquisitions would also increase from $10,000 to $100,000. So what you've got there is a reduction by $90,000 of the range in which that threshold would apply. So we'll forget the ceiling for a second. Let's assume it's still $250,000. You would be going from a $240,000 range to a range of $150,000. And so that's a $90,000 reduction. If you look on the GSA's website, where they have these proposals listed talking about increasing the simplified acquisition threshold, they don't mention a key part of their proposal. And I'm guessing I know why they didn't mention it, because it's not going to be a popular part when people figure out what's going on there. They mention increasing the simplified acquisition threshold from 250 to 10 million over 5 years. Understand from the government side why they're going to want to do that. And some contractors are going to say that's great because simplified acquisitions can be faster, they can be more efficient, they can be less burdensome from a regulatory perspective. We get why we might want to increase the ability, especially when we're talking about commercial items, and the government's really focused on commercial buys right now, where we understand that's best for efficiency for the taxpayers ultimately. What they don't mention, and you have to literally go to the red lines, because what GSA did, or OMB, it's the two of them working together here, did is they've got a summary of their proposals, which is what most people are going to read. Most people read the summary. And then they've got the actual red lines to the statute that they submitted to Congress. They sent the red lines to Congress and said, here's exactly how we want you to line out the statutes and amend them. And what they've done is they've said, simplified acquisition threshold, cross out the 250, and then for commercial items, increasing to 10. That's what the summary says. We're set there. But they've also gone to the piece of the statute in their proposed red line, which talks about that mandatory rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds. They have lined out the word simplified acquisition threshold and replaced it with $250,000, which is the current simplified acquisition threshold. So what they're proposing to do, GSA and OMB, is not to increase the small business rule of two concurrent with this increase in the simplified acquisition threshold, but rather to freeze it at the current level at $250,000, which means that if this proposal goes through, we're talking about a reduction of the range in which small business acquisitions are required by statute from $240,000 to $150,000. That's what proposing to do from a small business perspective. Some folks who are listening to this may recognize the name Guy Timberlake. He's been an advocate in this field for small businesses for decades. He ran the numbers. I trust Guy's math. And he said that if this had been the case in fiscal year 2024, if that range had been narrowed in the way GSA is proposing to do for next year, small businesses would have lost 1.1 million contracting actions and $4.2 billion in awards. That's what, if you apply that proposal to the last fiscal year, the guy says would have happened. I have no reason to doubt his math. He's very good at running those numbers. To me, that's a really alarming proposal, and it's one that's really hidden beneath the radar because it's not in the summary on the GSA website. You have to go to the red lines they propose and understand, follow the bouncing ball and go to the USC and see what this really means. And then you realize, wow, we're talking about a dramatic reduction in the amount of contracts to which the statutory rule of two would apply. That's literally what they're proposing.
So even if there's a bill in Congress to codify the rule of two, but these changes take effect, it's still going to have what effect that you just discussed, right?
Yeah, and so Congress has to decide which way it's going with this. This is OMB saying, here, Congress, here's what we'd like you to do with the rule of two, which is essentially to narrow it substantially. Meanwhile, there's a companion bill in both the House and Senate to do this. I was very pleased to see recently that there was a Senate companion bill introduced, and it's bipartisan. It's got two sponsors from each party. That bill would expand the rule of two. And so Congress ain't going to do both things. They're going to have to decide we're doing one or the other. Congress is being asked to amend the statute or do nothing and leave it the way it is. But Congress is being asked by OMB to narrow the rule of two. They're being asked by various members of Congress, as well as many small business advocates, to expand the statutory rule to match what's been in the FAR for a long time. Congress now has a decision to make.
So if you were to make a suggestion for small businesses concerned about this, what power do they have to influence the outcomes here?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the basic of contacting your members of Congress, because this sounds like not much. We're going to lose $100,000 to $10,000 range. That's not that big a deal. But as Guy ran the numbers and showed that adds up to billions of dollars in contracting. A lot of small businesses get their start in contracting with contracts of those dollar values. That's how they get their foot in the door. Some of them still do it for years, but others, that's their foot in the door. That's how they can get in without a huge record of past performance, by doing a $50,000 by proving their worth. It's really important. And so your members of Congress, these bills have been proposed in both House and Senate. They're available for consideration. Contacting your members of Congress and letting them know that you support these bills. If you need more information about the bills, you can reach out to me, send me an email, and I can send you specific numbers. Let your members of Congress know that you support these bills. If you are part of any industry, see if those organizations have put their weight behind these bills yet, because there's power in numbers, there's power in groups. And so if you're part of an industry organization that has not yet weighed in on these bills, getting their folks involved would be a helpful push as well. So just keeping the heat on Congress and letting them know that this is really going to hurt small businesses, letting them know the numbers Guy said, that like, this doesn't sound like much, but we're talking about billions of dollars in small business contracting. I'm your constituent. I'm going to be hurt by this. And hopefully that will help Congress understand that what they're being asked to do here is going to have real world impacts beyond what the summary says. The summary is all about efficiency and common sense, right? But is it common sense to reduce the range of the statutory rule of two in this manner?
Steve, I think what I'd like to do is take the transcript from this show today, and I'll put together a blog posting that maybe you could help to review, and we'll get that up on the Govology blog, or if you want to post it to your newsletter, so that I can understand how it might be challenging for some people to be able to communicate to their representative what they want them to fight for, right?
Think about how much time I took talking about statute and regulation and rule of two and why this matters. And this is to an audience that many folks are already familiar with this lingo and what some of this stuff means. Some members of Congress are too, but many are not. They are asked to be experts in everything. the government does. And so some of them know procurement really well, and many of them have no idea. They don't have a
Yeah.
background in this. So it can be really challenging trying to explain that. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, Carol, trying to put this in plain English and get down to brass tacks. I'm your constituent. This is going to hurt me. And here's why.
What would be the ideal outcome for small businesses if they were to advocate for a specific outcome? Is it to keep it like it is now, to codify the rule of two like got proposed and then just keep it where it is? Or if they're going to raise the thresholds, just keep it within the thresholds like it is now?
I think for me, I'm coming at this as a small business advocate, codify the rule of two in statute, because we've been using this rule for decades. Small businesses have been hitting that 23% goal most years recently, up to 27, 28%. That still means, by the way, that large businesses are getting 72%, 73% of the dollars. So they're not doing that badly for themselves, even under this rule of two. I don't think it's good public policy to eliminate the rule of two statutorily. By putting it in statute, just means is that the FAR Council, a regulatory body that's unelected, doesn't have the right to go in and monkey with it. And Congress can always go back in the future and say, we changed our minds. We don't think the rule of two, but I think putting it in there simply codifies what we've been doing in the government for years. If the rule of two goes away above the simplified acquisition threshold, I think it's going to be pretty devastating for small businesses. And keep in mind that while the government has been meeting that 23% goal and exceeding it in recent years, that's a dollar goal. The number of small businesses involved in federal contracting has been on a steady decline for about 15 years now. Last year was about 60,000 that were involved in federal contracting. It was up over 20,000 15 years ago. So we've had fewer and fewer small businesses involved in federal contracting. If we wipe out the rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold or narrow it so that small businesses can't get their foot in the door with low dollar values, we're going to see those numbers drop dramatically more. We're going to have a narrower industrial base. It's not meant to be eliminating these tools.
Industrial base, I mean, as you've blogged about before, it's already a shrinking industrial base, and the government is trying to figure out how to resolve this problem.
Correct. And so if we were saying, okay, we're going to take the primary tool, the rule of two that we use to push work to small businesses and get rid of it or narrow it, it's pretty obvious what that's going to do to the industrial base. Some folks are out there saying that could happen and some small businesses would still survive and thrive. That's true. But not last year, there were 60,951. I just pulled it up. Small businesses that sold the government. If you get rid of the rule of two or severely curtail it, it's going to be considerably less than that who are going to be selling moving forward. And that's a public policy decision that Congress needs to make. But we've long held in this country that having a broad industrial base, a broad small business industrial base is good. It's good for this country to have that competition, to have procurement spread about to main streets of different towns in every state in the union, all these sorts of things that small businesses can do to bring innovation to the market. And so if we eliminate this tool and don't replace it with anything, then that number is going to take a nosedive. And that seems logical and obvious.
Yeah, I think we need to send our own proposals to Congress. So
That's right. That's right. I'm going to start with my class at what is the rule of two and why it matters, because 9 Congress people, probably 9.9 out of 10 Congress people don't know that, and that's okay because they're not intended to be procurement experts, but it's important that they understand why what seems like an innocuous change and one that's going to increase efficiency. Don't doubt that it will in terms of just the speed and efficiency of making awards, but if we increase that simplified acquisition threshold to achieve that efficiency, but at the same time cap the rule of two at the current level, 250,000, without an inflationary adjustment that I can see, and then also eliminate the FAR part that says it applies above, I mean, we're really doing harm to small businesses. And so I hope that message can get across to Congress because they need to hear it.
One more thing on the rule of two before we move on to the next subject matter, which is going to talk about something as it relates to task order and delivery order protests. When it comes to GSA, because we're looking at in GSA schedules specifically, because agencies are looking at combining more of the traditional vehicles into GSA schedules, some folks reported that the spending might increase on GSA schedules 4 times. So currently, how does that rule of two apply within the context of GSA schedules? Is it just an open market rule, or does it also carry through to GSA?
Yeah, that's a great question because the rule of two is unclear in the statute to the extent to which it applies to task and delivery orders. And so it's essentially gone to a series of GAO bid protests and court decisions. The rule of two does not apply to GSA schedule buys, that there's an exception for those that agencies can do voluntarily, small business set-asides off the schedule, but they don't have to. For other types of GS in which you have small businesses, then there are court decisions saying, yeah, actually, you do need to apply the rule of two if you have both small and not small businesses on a non-GSA type GWAC. So moving more work over to the schedule could mean we have fewer set-aside opportunities for that reason alone. GSA schedules are often exempt from rules that apply to other procurements, even sometimes to other task and delivery order procurements. It's treated as a separate thing. And so that's a good point, Carroll. Moving that money over could have that impact. I get what the administration's doing with this consolidation. They're looking at best-in-class vehicles and moving work to existing vehicles rather than inventing new ones, because there is an efficiency argument to be made there too. And some folks will say, no. We saw a history where GSA was trying to do buys for other agencies, and that didn't go so well in the past. And so there's definitely views on different sides, but anyone who had to deal with a CIO SP4 over the many years may be of the mindset like, maybe we shouldn't have every agency going out and putting out these GWACs and doing that stuff, because it hasn't always worked out so well.
I want to talk about really quickly VA, because wasn't this part of the big Kingdom Ware case where the VA was essentially saying that the rule of two for veteran SDVOSB and veteran-owned small business procurements didn't apply to the GSA schedule. So in a way, if it went in GSA, the VA was like, well, it doesn't really count at this level, but they were like, yes, it does. And the Supreme Court found that the intent was that it does. Right?
Yeah.
Recap that one.
So that's right. That's a different rule of two. There's multiple rules of two. Yeah. It's not the one we've been talking about under FAR 19.5022. What we're talking about now is a specific rule known as the Veterans First policy, which is a statute. We're talking about a statutory policy that the VA prioritize veterans. The VA alone among agencies has this hierarchy statutorily where they are supposed to, if the rule of two, essentially two or more SDVOSBs, service disabled veteran-owned small businesses are available, then you set aside for them or do a sole source there. If not, then you go to veteran-owned small businesses. VA is the only agency that has authority to set aside and sole source contracts for VOSBs, and then down the chain to other types of small businesses and eventually to large. So the VA, when that statute was first passed, took the position that, as is the case with the small business rule of two under the FAR, the GSA schedule is essentially an exception to the SDVOSB, VOSB rule of two under the VA statutes. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It must have been almost 9 years ago now. And the Supreme Court said, nope, the statute's clear. You, VA, have an obligation to apply this SDVOSB, VOSB rule of two. The GSA schedule is not an exception for you. And that was a unanimous Supreme Court decision, 8-0. One justice seat was empty at the time. But that does not mean that the small business rule of two under the FAR applies to GSA schedule. It's a different rule of two, and it came from statutory authority that, in the Supreme Court's mind, was pretty clear. It didn't have any exceptions for the GSA schedule, and that's different than the rule of two for small businesses.
So I guess at the end of the day, what would be nice to see is that even if they do move those thresholds, that they keep the rule of two intact within any thresholds codified into law. It would be great if they did like the VA did, or the Supreme Court said, where you have to use it in the GSA schedules as well, because this is the purpose of giving small business opportunity with a lot of the procurements. If you were to study any of the NAICS codes, and you can go to some of the sites we use, kind of HireGov, go to the vehicle spend, like 90% of spending a lot of times in some of these vehicles are within GSA schedules. So in a way, if they're using GSA schedule for 90% of their procurements, they've kind of got an out from the small business rule of two anyway. So that should be fixed as well.
From a small business advocate perspective, I absolutely agree. It's a loophole. And while we're at it, why not close that loophole as well? And I know there'll be pushback from some in government saying that increases our paperwork and lowers efficiency and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a debate that could be had. For me, of course, I'm a small business advocate. I say, why have a giant loophole for avoiding the rule of two? But in the moment, we're kind of, for rule of two folks, are kind of on defense right now. We're playing defense against cutting it down, because potential for, in the ways we've discussed, to really limit that rule of two. So we're playing defense, hoping at some point we can go on the offense on behalf of small businesses and say, hey, Congress, let's close the loopholes here. The VA's attorneys were all like, the sky's going to fall if we have to do rule of two off the schedule. It didn't fall. It meant that they did more buys with SDVOSBs. Yeah. They did just fine. They implemented it. All right, no problem. And again, attorneys, and I've been one in my career, we can be prone to a little hyperbole when we're arguing on behalf of our clients. But if you looked at what the attorneys for VA were arguing, you would think that, the VA itself is going to implode if we had to do the rule of two for veterans 10 years ago. instead of doing schedule buys, of course, that
Yeah.
would happen.
Yeah. And the other reason why this is all important is because small businesses come into this landscape with limited experience and performance that maybe the large firms would have. If that's where most of the acquisitions are going, it's already hard enough for them to compete. And so, again, having this small business set asides are very important because it gives them a little bit of a sheltered area to do some work that's not competing up against the large firms where they're going to be disadvantaged even more by a lack of that experience and performance, economics, and everything else that goes within. Let's move to the last topic, and we'll kind of get through this one maybe a little bit quicker, but this one is on task and delivery order protest threshold parity. This proposal would increase the protest threshold for task and delivery orders under multiple award contracts from $10 million to $35 million for civilian agencies, matching the Department of Defense's threshold, which was most recently raised in 2024. So would you like to talk about that one? What should contractors understand about this one in particular?
Yeah, and so I think that's a fair summary of what the proposal is, unlike the other one, which on the simplified acquisition threshold, I thought they left out an important part of the proposal in the summary, which is the cap on the relationship to the rule of two. But yeah, the way it currently stands is that when you're filing bid protests challenging the award of a procurement with either the GAO or the Court of Federal Claims, there are separate rules that apply when you're challenging a task or delivery order award. Generally speaking, the Court of Federal Claims doesn't have jurisdiction to hear those protests. This is all done in the interest of efficiency. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has authority, but only over certain dollar values. Those dollar values have been steadily increasing throughout the years as Congress has listened to the pleas of the government, which, of course, remember, this proposal is coming from OMB and GSA, which is not a DOD entity, saying, we don't like protests. We don't like when people challenge our work. Please make it harder for folks to protest. That's an argument that people can have. I think it's important when we debate increasing protest thresholds, which really is just a question of, do we want to make it harder or impossible for contractors to file protests in certain cases? Because what we're talking about here is saying if you have a task or delivery order under 35 million, no matter what the agency does to screw it up, you can't challenge that. Is that something we want? Well, the government says, yeah, we want that. We want to wipe out protests entirely. As if they could get away with that, they probably would want that. And I understand that from their perspective. But I do think it's important to keep in mind the facts, because what you often hear is everything's getting protested. We're drowning in protests. I even saw that headline several years ago saying drowning in protests. And the answer is we're not. In fiscal year 2024 at GAO, and which is most of the protests are filed at GAO, there are about 1,800 protests total. The number of protests has dropped about 30% in the last 10 years for various reasons. One is increasing thresholds. Another is that contractors are getting more enhanced debriefings, which gives them more information to decide whether or not to protest. And I think most importantly, the so-called effectiveness rate of the protests at GAO has been pretty consistent around 50% over the last 10 years. And what does effectiveness rate mean? That means either the protester wins flat out, gets a sustain, or the agency voluntarily takes corrective action, says, whoops, we messed something up. And by the way, at DOD, the GAO recently published a stat saying about 1.5% of acquisitions are protested at DOD. And so protests are not all that common, and they are frequently successful. And by successful, I don't necessarily mean the protester gets the contract. When you file a protest, that's what you want. But a successful protest in terms of identifying flaws in the procurement process that lead to an agency taking corrective action happens about 50% of the time. So about 50% of the time, a protest does identify an actual acknowledged flaw in the procurement process. I think keeping these things in mind when we're talking about proposals to make it harder or impossible to protest is important. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't necessarily do that. There are arguments to be had for just that, saying we want streamlined acquisitions, we want to be more efficient, we don't want people looking over the shoulder. Okay, we can have that, but not from the perspective of hyperbole about everything's getting protested or protests are almost always frivolous and they almost always lose. Those just aren't true facts. The facts are out there. I hope that we have those conversations as this proposal goes to Congress and as other proposals. There's currently a proposal to kind of a loser pays the fees for certain protest proposal. As those go in front of Congress, they understand that protests are an important component of keeping the government honest, keeping procurement's transparent and fair, and that there's a price to be paid. The more that we make it difficult or impossible to protest, the less transparent the process becomes. It really is. So that's my context for it. I want Congress to have the facts in front of them about the frequency of protests and the effectiveness rate in terms of identifying flaws in the procurement process, and use that to decide whether it's makes sense to continue to make protests more difficult to file.
All right. Those were three great topics that Steve and I think you should watch and get involved with. Stephen, I'd love to work with you on putting together something that we could put on our blogs, and you could maybe post something also on your newsletter. For those not already subscribed to Stephen's GovCon Roundup newsletter, which inspired the show that we're doing today, I encourage you to look for it on LinkedIn. You could just Google GovCon Roundup LinkedIn, and you should be able to find it and join Stephen's newsletter. He puts out great updates to keep folks in the know. That could be one way we notify folks. Whatever we can put together would be helpful. We'll also post it on the Govology blog. And for those of you in our Govology community, we'll likely, when we do have that, we'll get it sent out on an email, because I really believe it's important for small businesses to put together proposals to Congress. Because right now, you've got the government making proposals, and without any other proposals coming in, they may just look at what's being proposed and say, okay. So I think it's important that we make the voice heard for small business. Stephen, thank you so much for this overview, for the insights. As always, this is going to conclude episode 3. So thank you guys for joining us, and we're going to see you guys on the next episode. Take care, everyone.